Penguin Audio presents No Retreat, No Surrender, One American's Fight by Tom DeLay with Stephen Mansfield. Read by Tom DeLay.
There is a memory that has come back to me often throughout my life. It is the scene of an ordeal that occurred when I was only 12, yet it has become the defining image of both my life and my politics. Late in 1959, my family was flying home to the United States after some years spent living in Venezuela. My father had been the general manager for a Tulsa-based oil company, then known as Helmerich & Payne, which serviced contracts throughout South America. This is what had landed us in the rainforests of Venezuela, where I spent many of my early years. But in time it had all become too much, particularly for my mother. There were revolutions and murders. Dead bodies sometimes hung from lampposts in our village square. I even had a near miss with a death squad, and not long afterward my mother understandably insisted that it was time for us to go home. So while my father concluded his business in Venezuela, my mother, my sister, my brother, and I flew back to America. In those days, planes flying from Caracas to the United States made fuel stops in Havana, Cuba. This may sound odd. Fidel Castro's revolution had begun on New Year's Day of 1959, and it may seem strange that planes filled with Americans would still be landing at Havana's Jose Marti Airport in the fall of that year. Remember, though, that the world had yet to see who Castro really was. The United States courted him more than we shunned him in the early months of his revolution, his unfolding thugocracy having yet to reveal itself fully. It was not until February of 1960 that Castro signed his oil compact with the Soviet Union and made his true intentions known to the world. Before then, he was still a darling of left-wing America. The rest of America hardly took notice. After Richard Nixon met with Castro, he dismissed the Cuban leader as naive. And Che Guevara, one of the most detestable lizards ever to crawl out from under Leninism's rock, was still a hero of Western radical chic in late 1959. Now, the world had yet to learn, or perhaps dare to acknowledge, who Castro really was, but I was about to. Our plane landed in Havana at midday. My mother told us to stay in our seats and that we would soon be taking off again. My brother and sister quickly fell fast asleep. I stayed awake, though, and looked out the window to see a handful of men in shabby green uniforms gathering on the tarmac. They each had rifles slung across one shoulder, and several of them restrained thickly muscled German shepherds on leather leashes. A moment later, one of the soldiers stepped to the front of our cabin and ordered all the Americans off the plane. Even these many years later, it is the smells I remember most. As we 15 or so terrified Americans inched haltingly off the plane, I breathed the lifeless odor of fuel on the runway, stagnant there between the rolling tarmac and the relentless Caribbean sun. Worse was the stench of the soldiers. Probably fresh from the dank jungle and wearing their only set of clothes, these guerrillas emitted a smell that somehow seemed part of their evil to my 12-year-old senses. They did not know that I spoke Spanish, and so they did not know that I understood their vulgarity, their snarling insults. Their words and their stench filled me with a sense of wickedness that has never left me. We were herded into a flat-roofed, dingy building at the end of the tarmac. Thankfully, a slight breeze worked its way through the windows, but the room was thick with the odor of 15 perspiring bodies, the sweaty foulness of the soldiers, and fear. We were kept there for hours, the leering suggestiveness of the soldiers tormenting the women. But I was tormented by what I saw on my mother's face. She was a strong Texas woman, but on this day, her face betrayed first her worry, then her overwhelming anxiety, and finally her terror. That's when she began to cry. This shattered me, and it was there, sitting on that nasty floor watching my mother weep, her husband 1,000 miles away, that I met for the first time the suffocating spirit of tyranny. It filled that room in all of its dark hues.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?